Hi, I'm Marcus Coward, and this is Wake Up New Bedford. I'm here with Mwalim. Mwalim, pleasure to have you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on, sir.
Absolutely. No, we have a lot to talk about, okay? You have had a long, illustrious life that has been filled with many successes, and I'm excited to dive in. So, for the people who don't know you, where are you from?
There's a split answer.
Okay, go ahead.
I was born in the Bronx,
Okay.
Bronx, New York. Grew up largely in the Bronx, but I'm also from and of Mashpee, Massachusetts. I'm a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I'm actually an elder of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe.
Yes, sir.
And so I have a lifelong relationship with this place.
Sure.
And in terms of New Bedford was always the city center for people from Mashpee.
Really?
Yeah.
How far away is that? The name sounds familiar.
Mashpee's on Cape Cod. It's actually exactly due west.
Sure.
I mean, due east, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
No,
due
due,
east.
it's exactly due east of New Bedford.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
yeah, and it's about, well, since I make the commute, it's about a 45-minute.
So that's where you currently live?
I'm back there, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I also have a foot in New Bedford, but
Sure.
yeah.
And so would you say that a lot of your business success has come from the Bronx and New Bedford, and Mashpee is really just your home base kind of thing?
It's been a mixed story.
Sure.
I guess in terms of, Mashpee is definitely a home base,
Yeah.
but it's where a lot of things sort of, I guess you could say, percolated.
Okay, talk about
It's
it.
been an incubator. To reach back, my background, I'm a musician and a playwright
Okay.
and a director and a filmmaker
Yes, sir.
and an author.
Yes, sir.
And Mashpee oftentimes provided that quiet space to think and create and develop.
Yeah.
And you also had outlets, now they're starting to come back, but back in the day you had outlets in Hyannis. You had a coffee shop. How could you get more of a traditional, almost stereotypical creative space than a cafe?
Sure.
You
sure,
had
sure.
a coffee shop that was a home for poetry, and you could present readings of theater, and you could play music there, and all sorts of things. It was called the Prodigal Son.
Okay.
And across the street, you had an art gallery where he opened up his space as sort of like a creation and performance space. So after every place else legally closed, you had Richard's Gallery as the after hours. So Cape Cod had a scene in the 90s.
Why did those places close?
Largely because you have the powers that be that sort of change the priorities of an area.
Sure.
There was a push to make Cape Cod less appealing to families and young people and to turn it into a retirement community.
Really?
And so it's ironic how many nightclubs are now, one nightclub is now a retirement home, the site. The Mill Hill Club is now the Mill Hill Retirement Residence. And one other nightclub that was long-standing is now a CVS.
Really? What a transition. Okay. Sure.
And it becomes now an interesting thing because of the housing market and sort of the constructed housing crisis. The people who can be the caretakers and even the first responders can't afford to live in the area where they're supposed to be working.
That's tricky.
Living. So it's but with that also creates a sort of shift in priorities in terms of arts and available arts and
Sure.
the different mechanisms. But what I found is that it was in '97, we started, I should backtrack, there was a small group of us, Native American, African American, Cape Verdean American artists on the Cape who were recognized. We were sort of pushed to the side
Sure.
by a lot of the existing opportunities, so we started creating our own, and that's where Oversoul Theater Collective was born in '94. Out of that, we'll present ourselves.
Sure.
Which was not at all an original idea. I was mentored by a lot of the people of the Black Arts movement, from the '60s. One in particular was the late actor-director James Spruill, who was the co-founder of New African Company in Boston.
Sure.
And he had in turn been a mentee of Amiri Baraka. aka Leroy Jones, and understood the creation of theater by, for, and about black people. And the axiom that I added was First Nation, by, for, and, tell our stories too, tell, in fact, our combined stories, those of us who are of mixed heritage.
Absolutely.
My mother's family is from Barbados and settled in New York, and my father's family, Mashpee Wampanoag.
Sure.
But of course, there's a line that also comes from Augusta, Georgia. So.
Yeah. So really from all over.
So and understanding and celebrating that that melange, and but in terms of telling these stories, and it became a matter of, with Oversoul, the focus became how do we create the stories, how do we celebrate these narratives, and that also came in. One of the people who mentored me was the late Linda Patton, playwright.
Okay. And
one of the main things that she taught me was how to write historic plays, how to depict elements of history, and how to tell our stories. And
now, was that earlier and later in life when you started to really focus on writing and playwriting?
Playwriting was something that sort of, I guess you could say, ran parallel to my work with music.
Sure. Okay.
I started initially sketch writing, and this was when I was in college.
Really?
At Boston University, I was part of the Black Drama Collective.
Sure.
And we used to do things called coffee houses where we had skits. And so I started writing skits.
Okay.
And
these were comedy skits?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
By and large, or of course, very, very pointed messages.
Sure.
Which was one of the things that first connected, because I was actually a music major, but it was one of the things that first connected me with Jim Spruill, who at the time was a professor of theater.
At Boston University?
Yeah.
Really?
And
okay.
So he's seeing this student who's writing skits and sketches, and we began to dialogue around that. And also, because my initial entry into his theater company was as a composer in residence.
Okay.
Writing music for some of the plays and background music and so forth.
So, rewinding a little bit, so in early childhood, what would you say was your first love? Was it music? Was it history? What was your first fascination?
Honestly, I got hit with music and storytelling at the same time.
Okay, talk about it.
My mother, love of music and also an opera singer.
Oh, interesting.
But had a love of all types of music. So she had a jazz record collection and R&B record collection. So hearing Ray Charles and Jimmy Smith and Aretha Franklin, but then at the same time hearing Joan Sutherland and Leontine Price and Marian Anderson and Vilda Valentine, so you're getting this melange of opera, and also she had an incredible calypso collection of records that came over from Barbados that relatives had sent over. So, and of course, we all comb through our parents' record collections.
Always, yeah.
So hearing all of this, and then being exposed to symphonic music, and likewise, my grandfather was a pianist. He was trained as a concert pianist, but came to this country and discovered the 1920s. There's no such thing as a black concert pianist.
Yeah.
So he became a band leader. So band leader and record producer for Decca and Southern, and was one of the people who actually introduced calypso into the American music vocabulary. So when you hear calypso influences in like Jackie Wilson's music and things like this, it comes from reaching to this cross-section of jazz musicians who were from the Caribbean. And but he was my first piano teacher. But before he taught me piano in school, the instrument that I was assigned was the viola.
Oh, really?
So I started out as a viola player, and that was the instrument that I got into music and art high school with.
Sure.
And while at music and art, I was studying piano with him, and began to focus more on composition.
And so were you really just, were you ever singing or playing musical instruments more so?
At that point, I was more so playing musical instruments.
Yeah.
It was a funny thing, but when you went to music and art high school, they really discouraged you from focusing on anything other than what you came in. So they were frowning at me playing jazz piano because I came in as a viola player.
Sure, yeah.
And it's sort of like, but I'm still doing music, and this is still an influence.
Of course, yeah.
And of course, they really lost their minds when I started playing jazz viola and putting.
I don't know if I've ever heard of that. Okay.
Well, when you think about it, the viola is an alto instrument just like a saxophone.
Really?
So
Yeah.
I was playing a lot of Charlie Parker tunes
Okay.
on the viola, and it was sort of like, what are you doing? Stop that, you know. And of course, if you were an instrumental major, they really tried to discourage you from singing, and if you were a vocal major, they tried to discourage you from playing an instrument.
So that answers that, yeah.
And I didn't really think much of my voice, honestly. It was the funny thing of actually coaching singers, playing with different groups. And one time playing with a group where I had coached the singer, and the singer didn't show up for the gig, so they put the microphone in front of me.
Sure.
And that was my first public performance. And at the end, the band leader was like, well, guess who our new singer is?
Wow.
And very helpful having a mom who's a opera singer.
In what way?
She was able to teach me proper breathing and vocal placement.
Sure.
And the fact that the same breathing and vocal placement that you use in opera, you use in R&B, you use in blues, you use in gospel, you use in jazz.
Now, was she teaching this to you when you were growing up, or really once you started to sing?
Once I started to sing, I mean, there were different things she had shown me earlier.
Sure.
Just because, you know, you're sitting down and you're a songwriter, so you're going through, and she's like, oh, well, try it like, you know, try breathing like this. And so singing was the last thing to sort of come into my...
Sure.
Well, no, actually, the last thing to come into my repertoire was the guitar.
Really? Okay.
That I learned during the pandemic. It was an instrument that had eluded me for like all the 40 years prior, and it was actually the guitarist, bass player from our band, Alphonse III, who said, oh, you think like a piano player, so play it like this. And it was, oh, and...
It all clicked.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how many instruments would you say you know right now?
If I just, you know, sort of broke it down in general, I play the keyboards, I play African percussion, I can track a drum part, but I wouldn't call myself a drummer per se. I leave that to ZYG.
Sure.
And I play the viola, which translates to the violin and the cello. I play the bass, which I more so picked up from playing the guitar.
Sure.
You know, and I play the guitar. And yeah, in terms of the keyboards, pretty much all of the keyboard instruments, including including the percussion, so it'd be vibraphone, marimba. And
so, do you feel like going to Boston University was a crucial part of your growth and your musical growth?
I would say more in my socio-political growth overall.
Sure.
And understanding the framework of the arts and how the arts fit in to the system. I would say that was probably more the impact of...
So talk a little bit about that. How do the arts fit into the system?
The arts are frightening to the system.
Okay.
Because it's about expression, and it's about expression on a variety of levels, and it's about expression that can reach the ears and brains of a number of people, and that can be dangerous.
It's about nonconformity.
Precisely. Because, you know, for example, you look at the current situation where they're trying to slash the NEA and the NEH entirely, and, you know, get rid of it, and then you look at other countries where the arts are a strong part of their budget and activity. You look at Canada, and the fact that funding arts and arts education are a strong part of their activity and mission, at least currently. And the same thing when you look at countries in Europe. You look at France, you look at Holland, and look at the importance of sustaining, and even Britain, and you look at the importance of sustaining the arts. You look at the fact that they're very prolific in terms of releasing films and television, and that most of it is government funded.
Yeah, totally.
And you look at what they do to PBS here in terms of, so arts have always, and when you look at arts movements, they've almost always been tied to certain levels of resistance.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, when you look at the Black Arts movement, when you even look at the advances made during the Harlem Renaissance, even though the Harlem Renaissance was largely funded by wealthy white patrons, still a lot of the scholarly work that came about out of that, a lot of the work of Alain Locke and so forth, in terms of documenting the time period and documenting the social and political structure that made it possible, and also why it sort of faded away.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah.
And you look at the periods where you would almost say the short Enlightenment periods, where suddenly money was put into education and suddenly money was put into the arts, and then just as quickly it was pulled away.
Yep.
Because you recognize that this is happening, but this intellectual development is creating a counterculture. So.
And so you might have mentioned before that composing and writing kind of went hand in hand. Okay, so did you feel like with composing, writing, and also being a musician, it was a lot to juggle, or do you feel like it all just naturally worked together?
It's a funny thing. For me, they feed each other.
Okay.
It seemed to be more of a problem for other people.
Sure. They want to put you in a box and I'm good. No, okay, just let me do me.
Because the joke, I'd gone back to New York in 2001. It was, in fact, here's to tell you about Cape Cod.
Please.
I'd put in a resume to one of the arts organizations on Cape Cod. I'll even say who it is because it was a while back, the Orleans Academy.
Okay.
And I'd also had an application in New York City.
Sure.
Well, I get a phone call from the then director at the Orleans Academy who said, well, by my reputation, I didn't really have what it takes, and he felt that it was kind to tell me that, I'm wasting my time trying to break into this field. And I'm like, and you're telling me this based on reputation, but not direct information of my work, and reputation from whom?
Great questions.
But none of this is being directly shared. And as I'm sitting there contemplating driving to Orleans and committing violence, my phone rings again, and the second phone call is from Lincoln Center.
Oh,
and the Lincoln Center Directors Lab was inviting me to come join the Lincoln Center Directors Lab.
Wow.
So I realized that obviously New York City and Broadway have much lower standards than Cape Cod.
Yeah.
So I relocated to New York.
Yeah.
And what was supposed to be a 3-week gig turned into 3 years.
Wow.
But, and I can tell you, post 9/11 was an interesting time to be working in New York City.
Sure. Even in the art field?
In every field. In every field. You realize how real it is when you live in the Bronx and work in Brooklyn, and you have to go through 2 military checkpoints to get to and from work.
It was like that?
Yeah.
Wow.
For quite some time.
Wow.
Because remember, to get to Brooklyn, you have to go across either the Manhattan or the Brooklyn Bridge, which are in lower Manhattan, which were east of what used to be the Twin Towers. So it was an interesting time. But what I came to find in New York City, it was interesting because you sort of saw that New York had a tradition. So that theater companies that existed now, professional black theater companies that existed now, had some level of connection to the same ones that existed in the 60s, which had a connection to the ones that existed in the 50s, which had a connection to the ones that existed in the early 1900s.
There was a rich history there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you had, for example, the New Federal Theater, you realize the New Federal Theater somewhat grew out of the New Lafayette Theater, and the New Lafayette Theater was in honor of the Lafayette Theater, which was the theater that had presented Orson Welles' production of Macbeth.
Really?
Set in Haiti.
Oh, really?
Which was funded by the WAP, which was a federal program of providing training. So what he did was provided theater training funded by the federal government. See where we begin to see these interesting.
That sounds like it was during an Enlightenment period.
That was, and it's interesting because those are the periods that become vilified.
Of course, yeah. For one reason or another.
Yeah. And but looking at this connective tissue, it was an interesting time to be in New York because a lot of the people the elders who have now joined the ancestors, were still there and vibrant and still available.
Yes.
And so it was possible to take the PATH train over to Newark on a Saturday afternoon when Amiri Baraka had one of his backyard soirees, and this type of thing was still going on. And I wrote about this period in terms of the connective tissue and recognizing there was an arts movement that wasn't really being talked about. That was sort of like, if you will, a parallel to hip hop, where you had you still had your poets and your painters and your jazz musicians and your R&B musicians, and you started to see elements of this underground coming out. Like, for example, the period they talk about neo soul, the D'Angelo and Angie Stone, they and Erykah Badu, they were the public faces of a more underground movement that was sort of circling back to the compositional styles of the 70s and the 60s and the socio-political messages that were coming out of, you know, during that time, the Curtis Mayfields and the Donny Hathaways and the Marvin Gayes. So it was an interesting time to be part of that New York scene. But to give you the rundown, so I was working.
If I can just ask, what decade are we in right now?
Right now, we're in.
Oh yeah, you're talking about post 9/11, so
right,
yeah, early 2000s.
Well, I would say 2000 into 2001, 2003.
So okay.
So that period.
Okay.
Because I was I was in New York pretty much full time. I would say around 2000.
Sure.
So in 2000, I had a CD out called Thief in the Night, and I was self-touring it.
Okay, sure.
And ended up selling altogether about 15,000 copies of it out of my trunk.
That's crazy. That's amazing.
But you do a show and CDs were still the medium, so so flip CDs, and I was playing everywhere between pretty much like the southern part of New Hampshire all the way down into the DMV. So and you had a lot, and the open mic culture was big at that point.
Alive and well. Yeah, for sure.
And came to realize that from the other cats on that it was okay, where you make your money is your merchandise. All right, so you have books, you have CDs, and my CD sold.
Yeah.
From the CD, I then, because I was also part of underground dance music culture.
Sure.
And knew all the clubs up and down. So I ended up coming out with a vinyl, which was still the medium for underground dance music, came out with a vinyl EP called Jazzy Soul Club Grooves. And the fun story about how I broke that record, they were a club in New York called The Shelter.
Sure.
And the resident DJ is Timmy Regisford.
Okay.
And the thing that I knew about Timmy Regisford was he likes to play test pressings, not records that have been out. So I had the record fully pressed, but I also got an extra test pressing. So I go to The Shelter and I give him the test pressing.
Sure.
And I have a box of records with me. And about an hour and a half later, I hear one of my records come on.
Sure.
So wow. So I go stand near the door of the DJ booth, and I see DJs going up to ask him, and his answer is always, "It's not out yet."
Yeah.
And I could tell, reading his lips, "It's not out yet." I'd watch the person come out, and I'm like, "You just asked him about that record?" "Yeah." Side B, second track, side B. So I handed out about 50 copies of the record that night. In about a week, I was getting messages from, because it was international night as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I'm getting messages from distributors in Germany and France asking for a couple of hundred copies.
Wow.
So ended up with an international hit record out of this. It was possible to do it back then.
Yeah.
But so I had that going on. I was working as a video editor for a subsidiary of Universal out of Brooklyn.
Sure.
And also started to talk to them about doing stuff with music production. I ended up then as a staff producer for a different company that was a subsidiary of a different major. And that was the dark period.
Sure.
At the same time, I was leading a house band at one of the nightclubs in Greenwich Village at a spot called the Baggett Inn.
Okay.
And was also still doing the nightclub circuit.
Yeah.
With my solo work, and but at the same time I was teaching creative writing for the Bronx Writers Center, and doing workshops for the African Poetry Theater, which was out in Queens.
Sure.
And so I was also very active as a playwright. So my work was getting produced at the Point up in the Bronx, at the Harlem Theater Company, at the New Eurekan, at the La Mama, at the African Poetry Theater, at the Brooklyn Moon. So it was sort of like, the joke I have is I was probably the only New York musician who had theater as a day job.
Sure. Yeah. Because I was just going to ask, like, did you, at that time, maybe a lot of people knew you as a musician, but what did you feel like most identified you? And I mean, there probably isn't one clear answer.
There isn't.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess I would just call myself a creative.
Yes, yeah.
And I admired people growing up you know, it was cool to see, okay, there are people who do this too. So watching somebody like Paul Robeson and looking at, okay, so this was an all-American football player who was an opera singer and an actor and an activist and sort of like, okay, so yeah, and oh yes, and an attorney. So,
yeah.
So it was, so recognizing, okay, this is what you're looking at, or then somebody like Melvin Van Peebles, who decides, oh, okay, so they're not going to let me make movies in Hollywood. Well, all right, I'll go to France. Oh, you can get money to make movies if you're an author? Got you. So he writes 3 novels in French.
Wow.
And gets a director's card.
Wow.
And makes a movie from one of his novels.
Yeah.
And gets it placed in the San Francisco Film Festival, which leads to him now becoming a director again in Hollywood.
What a story.
So,
Yeah.
but you know, but looking at these, it was sort of like the wonderful thing was, and again, he was in the phone book, so he was somebody I could actually like sit down and have a conversation with about, so how do you do, and how did you do, and what?
Things were so much more accessible back then.
Oh yeah, big time, big time. But a lot of that, I would say, those interactions informed, you know, getting back to New Bedford, it informed what I do here, what I did here, because 2003.
So I don't mean to cut you off,
right.
but part 1 is wrapping up.
Okay.
We're in our last minute, and I do want to pick up where we left off. So hold that thought.
Okay. All right.
In starting part 2, I would like to ask you about this air of collaboration. Okay, that was something I wanted to ask you, but we kind of ran out of time. But along in part 2, then we can talk about some of this wonderful material that we have. And then we can talk about some of the things you're doing right now and for future plans.
Okay.
And so this has been Wake Up New Bedford with Mwalim, the creative. And you can catch us in part 2, where we continue this conversation and talk about some of the things that he's doing now, along with some of his future plans. Thanks so much for watching, and catch us in part 2. Peace.